The mahogany conference table gleamed under the fluorescent lights of Sterling & Associates law firm as Audrey Simpson sat perfectly still, her weathered hands folded in her lap, watching her 3 adult children's faces transform from boredom to shock to fury. The leather portfolio before her contained documents that would change everything, and she had waited 73 years to feel this moment of absolute clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. What do you mean, donated to charity? Her eldest son Richard's voice cracked like a teenager's, though he was pushing 50. His manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table as he leaned forward, his Armani suit straining against his expanding waistline. Mother, you can't be serious about this. Audrey's attorney, Margaret Chen, cleared her throat professionally. Mrs. Simpson has elected to distribute her estate, valued at approximately $47 million, among various charitable organizations: the Children's Education Fund, the local animal shelter, the Community Center Renovation Project, and several scholarship programs for underprivileged students. The silence that followed was broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the barely audible hum of the air conditioning. Audrey studied each of her children's faces, memorizing this moment when they finally understood that their words had consequences. Her daughter Patricia, 38 and perpetually dissatisfied, was the first to find her voice. "This is ridiculous. You're having some kind of breakdown. We'll contest this. You can't just throw away our inheritance because you're angry about some silly argument." Audrey's youngest, Michael, 28 and still living in her guest house despite having graduated from law school 2 years ago, simply stared at the documents as if they might spontaneously combust. His usual confident smirk had vanished, replaced by something resembling panic. "I'm not angry," Audrey said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of 7 decades of experience. "I'm disappointed. But more than that, I'm finally free." 3 months earlier, Audrey Simpson had been preparing for what she believed would be a joyous family celebration. The sprawling colonial house in Westchester County buzzed with activity as caterers arranged elegant hors d'oeuvres and florists positioned arrangements of white roses throughout the first floor. After 45 years of building Simpson Technologies from a small electronics repair shop into a multinational corporation, Audrey was finally ready to step down as CEO and enjoy her retirement. The party was meant to celebrate her official retirement and announce her succession plan, a carefully orchestrated transition that would see her children taking over different divisions of the company. She had spent months with consultants and lawyers, structuring the business to ensure each of her children would inherit not just wealth, but purpose and legacy. Audrey moved through her kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had hosted countless business dinners and charity galas over the decades. At 73, she remained sharp and energetic, her silver hair styled in an elegant bob that framed intelligent green eyes behind designer glasses. She had dressed carefully for the evening in a navy blue dress that conveyed both authority and maternal warmth. The guest list included her children and their families, key employees from Simpson Technologies, several members of the local business community, and a few close friends from her various charitable boards. Audrey had imagined this as the perfect capstone to her career, a moment when she could look around the room and see the impact of her life's work reflected in the faces of people she loved and respected. Richard arrived first with his wife Melissa and their twin daughters, 16-year-old Sophie and Emma. Audrey's heart lifted as she watched her granddaughters bound through the front door, their energy and enthusiasm a bright contrast to their parents' increasingly frequent complaints about money and expectations. "Grandma Audrey," Sophie called out, wrapping her arms around Audrey's waist. "Mom said you're finally going to retire, and that means you'll have more time to come to our soccer games." Audrey smiled, stroking Sophie's dark hair. "That's exactly what it means, sweetheart. I'm looking forward to being a full-time grandmother for a while." Richard kissed his mother's cheek perfunctorily before immediately gravitating toward the bar that had been set up in the living room. "Mother, we need to talk about the succession timeline. I've been thinking about some changes to the manufacturing division that could increase profits by 15% in the first quarter." Audrey noticed that Richard's first words weren't congratulations or expressions of pride in her achievements, but immediately focused on business and profit. Still, she pushed down her disappointment and smiled. "Tonight is for celebrating, Richard. We'll have plenty of time for business discussions next week." Patricia arrived 20 minutes later with her husband David, apologizing for their tardiness, while simultaneously criticizing the valet parking arrangement. "Mother, honestly, having cars parked on the street looks so tacky. You should have hired a service to shuttle people from the country club." Audrey had actually considered the shuttle option, but decided that the more intimate setting of her home would be more meaningful for this particular celebration. She bit back her first response and instead helped Patricia hang up her coat. "I wanted everyone to feel welcome in our family home, sweetheart. This felt more personal." "Personal doesn't mean it has to look cheap," Patricia muttered, then immediately shifted into her social mode as she spotted several prominent business leaders in the living room. "Oh, is that Senator Morrison? I need to talk to him about David's campaign for city council." Michael was the last to arrive, strolling in 30 minutes late, with an air of casual indifference that had become his trademark since graduating from law school. He wore an expensive suit that Audrey had bought him for job interviews, though she knew he hadn't been on any interviews in months. "Sorry I'm late, Mom," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I was on a call with a headhunter about a position at a firm in Manhattan. Big opportunities coming up." Audrey had heard about various big opportunities from Michael for 2 years, none of which had materialized into actual employment. She hugged him anyway, choosing to focus on the positive. "I'm just glad you're here, honey. This is an important night for our family." As the evening progressed, Audrey found herself observing her children with growing unease. Richard spent most of his time networking with other business owners, discussing market trends and investment opportunities, while barely acknowledging the significance of the occasion. Patricia flitted from group to group, name-dropping and social climbing with an intensity that made several guests visibly uncomfortable. Michael positioned himself near the appetizer table and the bar, contributing little to conversations but consuming liberally. The moment that would change everything came during Audrey's planned speech. She had positioned herself at the bottom of the grand staircase, using a small microphone to address the gathered crowd. Her words about legacy, family values, and the responsibility that comes with success were met with polite applause and genuine warmth from most of the guests. "Simpson Technologies has always been about more than profit," Audrey said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "It's been about innovation, community service, and creating opportunities for others. As I step down, I'm confident that the next generation will continue to honor those values while building something even greater." She paused, looking directly at her children. "Richard, Patricia, and Michael, you've grown up understanding that privilege comes with responsibility. You've seen firsthand how business success can be a platform for positive change in the community. I'm excited to see how you'll use your inheritance not just to build wealth, but to build a better world." The applause was enthusiastic, and Audrey felt a surge of pride and hope. Several guests approached her afterward to comment on what a wonderful legacy she was leaving, and how fortunate her children were to have such a strong foundation. But as the evening wound down and the last guest departed, Audrey overheard a conversation that shattered her carefully constructed expectations. She was in the kitchen, wrapping leftover food and supervising the caterer's cleanup, when she heard her children's voices from the adjacent breakfast nook. They had apparently forgotten that the pass-through window between the kitchen and breakfast area was open, or perhaps they simply didn't care if she heard them. Finally, Richard's voice carried a tone of relief and excitement. "I was starting to think she'd never retire. Do you know how frustrating it's been watching her make decisions about our company while I'm stuck in middle management?" "Our company?" Patricia's laugh was sharp and calculating. "Richard, please. Mom built that business. We just happened to be born into it." "Exactly my point," Richard continued. "We've been waiting our whole lives for this. Finally, we can modernize the operation, streamline the workforce, maybe explore some international manufacturing options. The profit margins could be incredible." Michael's voice joined the conversation, slightly slurred from the evening's consumption. "I don't really care about the business side. I just want to know when we can access the trust funds. I've got some investment opportunities that could really pay off." "Investment opportunities?" Patricia's tone was skeptical. Michael, you've been living in Mom's guest house for 2 years without paying rent. What investments are you talking about? I'm talking about real estate, cryptocurrency, maybe a startup or two. The kind of moves that could turn our inheritance into something really significant. But I need capital to get started. Audrey's hands stilled on the plastic wrap she had been pulling from its box. She found herself leaning closer to the window, straining to hear every word while hoping desperately that the conversation would take a different turn. The thing is, Richard said, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone, we need to be smart about how we handle Mom during this transition. She's got all these ideas about community service and charitable giving. We need to make sure she doesn't go overboard with the philanthropic stuff before we can restructure. What do you mean? Michael asked. I mean, Richard's voice was patient, as if explaining something obvious. Mom's gotten very sentimental about giving money away.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Look at tonight. All that talk about responsibility and building a better world. That's fine for speeches, but it's not good business. We need to convince her that the best way to honor Dad's memory and her legacy is to focus on growing the company's value. Patricia's voice carried a note of agreement. Richard's right. Mom's been very generous with charitable donations over the years. But now that she's retiring, she might get even more carried away with that kind of thing. We need to help her understand that family should come first. Besides, Michael added, what has all that charity work really accomplished? The community center is still falling apart, the scholarship kids still struggle, and the animal shelter is always begging for more money. It's like throwing money into a black hole. Audrey felt as if the floor had shifted beneath her feet. These were her children, the people she had raised to understand compassion and social responsibility, discussing her life's work as if it were an obstacle to their financial goals. The problem, Richard continued, is that Mom's always been too emotional about business decisions. She makes choices based on feelings instead of logic. Like keeping that entire division in Ohio just because the workers have been with the company for 20 years. From a business perspective, it makes no sense. Or insisting on paying above-market wages for factory workers, Patricia added. I know she thinks it's the right thing to do, but it's money that could be going to research and development, or executive compensation, or shareholder returns. Michael's voice carried a note of frustration. Look, I love Mom, but let's be honest. She's from a different generation. All this stuff about giving back and social responsibility, it's nice in theory, but it's not realistic in today's economy. We need to focus on what actually matters, which is building wealth and securing our family's future. Audrey gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, her knuckles white against the granite surface. She had spent decades teaching her children about the importance of using privilege responsibly, about the obligation that comes with success, about the satisfaction that comes from helping others. But listening to their casual dismissal of those values, she realized that her lessons had fallen on deaf ears. The thing that really bothers me, Richard said, his voice carrying a harder edge, is how Mom acts like she's some kind of business genius. Yes, she built the company, but that was 40 years ago. The business world has changed completely since then. Her approaches are outdated, her priorities are misplaced, and honestly, her leadership style is holding us back. Exactly, Patricia agreed enthusiastically. I mean, we respect what she accomplished, but that doesn't mean we have to keep doing things her way forever. It's time for fresh thinking, modern strategies, real business acumen. Michael's laugh was ugly and dismissive. Fresh thinking? Mom's idea of innovation is buying better coffee for the break rooms. She has no clue about current market dynamics, digital transformation, or global competitiveness. Honestly, what does she really have to offer at this point besides money and outdated opinions? The words hit Audrey like a physical blow. What does she really have to offer? After 45 years of building a successful business, raising 3 children as a single mother after her husband's death, serving on numerous charitable boards, and dedicating her life to creating opportunities for others, her own son was questioning what she had to offer. That's a little harsh, Michael, Patricia said, though her tone suggested she didn't really disagree. Mom's not completely useless. She's good at the relationship stuff, the networking, the public relations side of things. But you're right that her actual business insights are pretty limited at this point. Limited? Richard's voice carried a note of incredulity. Patricia, Mom's business insights are practically non-existent. She's been coasting on past success and good intentions for years. The only reason the company is still profitable is because of the foundation Dad built and the improvements I've been implementing behind the scenes. Audrey's breathing became shallow and rapid. Richard was claiming credit for the company's continued success, dismissing her ongoing contributions as if they were irrelevant. She thought about the countless hours she had spent over the past decade, modernizing operations, developing new product lines, and maintaining relationships with key clients. But apparently, in her children's eyes, none of that mattered. Look, Michael said, his voice taking on a practical tone, we all know Mom means well, but meaning well doesn't qualify someone to make major business decisions or control millions of dollars in assets. The kindest thing we can do is help her transition into a more appropriate role for someone her age. A more appropriate role? Patricia asked. You know, grandmother activities, maybe some light volunteer work, social functions, things that match her actual capabilities instead of pretending she's still a business leader. Audrey's eyes filled with tears as she listened to her children discuss her future as if she were a beloved but incompetent elderly relative who needed to be managed for her own good. The casual cruelty of their assessment was breathtaking. The bottom line, Richard said with the authority of someone delivering a final verdict, is that Mom's had her time. She did well for her generation, but this is our time now. We have the education, the vision, and the energy to take Simpson Technologies to the next level. We just need to help Mom understand that stepping aside completely is the best thing for everyone. Including her, Patricia added. She'll be much happier focusing on things she's actually good at instead of trying to stay relevant in a business world that's passed her by. Michael's voice carried a note of finality. Exactly. It's time for Mom to accept that she doesn't have much to offer the business world anymore. The sooner she realizes that, the sooner we can all move forward. Audrey stood frozen in her kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had been meant to honor her life's work, listening to her children casually dismiss her value and plan her irrelevance. The words, "What does she really have to offer?" echoed in her mind like a cruel refrain. She thought about the scholarship students who had sent her thank you letters over the years, describing how Simpson Technologies' educational grants had changed their lives. She thought about the families whose jobs she had saved during economic downturns by refusing to make layoffs that would have boosted short-term profits. She thought about the community center that served hundreds of children because of her donations, the animal shelter that had expanded its programs because of her support, the medical research that had been funded through her foundation. But according to her own children, none of that constituted having something to offer. In their view, her decades of experience, her network of relationships, her commitment to ethical business practices, and her proven track record of balancing profit with purpose were not just irrelevant but actually obstacles to their success. Audrey quietly finished cleaning the kitchen, her movements mechanical as her mind processed the full implications of what she had heard. When her children eventually wandered in to say goodnight, she managed to smile and accept their perfunctory hugs while feeling as if she were looking at strangers. Great party, Mom, Richard said, kissing her cheek. We'll talk next week about the transition timeline. Yes, Patricia agreed. We have so many exciting ideas for the company's future. You're going to love seeing what we accomplish. Michael simply hugged her and mumbled something about being tired before heading to the guest house. After they left, Audrey sat alone in her living room, surrounded by the empty glasses and crumpled napkins left behind by the evening's guests. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of what should have been one of the happiest nights of her life. Instead, it had become the night she learned that her children saw her not as a mentor, role model, or business leader, but as an obstacle to their ambitions and a relic of an outdated era. The night she discovered that the values she had tried to instill in them had been not just ignored, but actively rejected. The night she realized that the fortune she had planned to leave them would be used to undo everything she had spent her life building. As she turned off the lights and made her way upstairs to her bedroom, Audrey Simpson began to consider possibilities she had never imagined before. If her children truly believed she had nothing to offer, perhaps it was time to offer her something to people who would actually appreciate its value. The seed of an idea began to form in her mind, an idea that would grow over the following weeks into a plan that would shock her children and force them to confront the consequences of their casual cruelty. But that night she simply lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered how the children she had loved and sacrificed for had become people she barely recognized. The next morning brought the first of many conversations that would cement Audrey's growing resolve. She was in her home office, reviewing quarterly reports from Simpson Technologies, when Richard called to schedule a meeting about the succession plan. "Mother, I've been thinking about our discussion timeline," he said without preamble. "I think we should accelerate the transition. The sooner we can implement some of the changes Patricia, Michael, and I have been planning, the better positioned we'll be for next year's market challenges." Audrey set down her reading glasses and leaned back in her chair. "What kind of changes are you referring to, Richard?" "Well, for starters, we need to modernize our manufacturing operations. I've been looking at facilities in Mexico and Vietnam, where we could significantly reduce labor costs. The Ohio plant is dragging down our margins." Audrey felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The Ohio facility employed 300 people, many of whom had worked for Simpson Technologies for decades. The plant manager, Tom Rodriguez, had started as a line worker 25 years ago and worked his way up through determination and loyalty. His daughter had just started college on a Simpson Technologies scholarship. "Richard, those are good people in Ohio. They've been with us through difficult times, and their productivity has consistently exceeded industry standards." "Mom, sentiment doesn't pay dividends. We're running a business, not a charity. Our obligation is to shareholders and to maximizing returns. Keeping inefficient operations running because we feel sorry for the workers isn't good business." The word charity stung particularly deeply after the previous night's revelations. Audrey realized that Richard saw her commitment to employee welfare as a weakness, rather than a strength, a sentimental indulgence, rather than a core business principle. "Our obligation," Audrey said carefully, "is to run a sustainable business that creates value for all stakeholders, including our employees and the communities where we operate." Richard's sigh was audible through the phone. "See, this is exactly what Patricia and I were talking about. You're thinking like a social worker instead of a CEO. That approach might have worked 30 years ago, but it's not viable in today's competitive environment." Audrey found herself wondering if Richard had forgotten that she had successfully navigated multiple economic downturns, several major industry transformations, and countless competitive challenges while maintaining both profitability and employee loyalty. But apparently, in his view, those accomplishments were irrelevant to current business realities. "Richard, I'd like to understand more about these plans you, Patricia, and Michael have been developing. When did you start working together on company strategy?" There was a pause, and Audrey could almost hear Richard realizing that he had revealed more than he intended. "We've just been having informal conversations about the future. Nothing formal, of course. We respect that you're still CEO. But the damage was done." Audrey now understood that her children had been meeting behind her back, developing plans to reshape the company according to their vision, while paying lip service to her continued leadership. The succession plan she had been carefully crafting to ensure a smooth transition was apparently irrelevant to their actual intentions. "I see," Audrey said. "And these informal conversations, do they include discussions about my role during the transition?" Another pause. "Well, naturally, we think it would be best if you could step back gradually. You know, reduce your day-to-day involvement so you can focus on the things you really enjoy." There it was again, the suggestion that her current contributions were somehow inappropriate for someone of her age, and that she would be happier pursuing activities more suited to an elderly person's limited capabilities. "And what things do you think I really enjoy, Richard? You know, spending time with the grandchildren, your garden, maybe some light volunteer work? The kind of activities that would give you fulfillment without the stress of major business decisions." Audrey looked around her office. at the awards recognizing her business leadership, the photographs from groundbreaking ceremonies and community events, the shelves lined with industry publications and strategic planning documents. This room represented 45 years of passionate engagement with business challenges and opportunities. But, according to her son, she would be happier arranging flowers and babysitting. "I'll think about what you've said, Richard. Let's schedule a formal meeting next week to discuss the transition in more detail." After hanging up, Audrey sat in silence for several minutes, processing the full implications of the conversation. Her children weren't planning to build on her legacy. They were planning to dismantle it. They weren't seeking to learn from her experience. They were seeking to escape from it. And they weren't honoring her values. They were actively rejecting them. The phone rang again, interrupting her thoughts. This time, it was Patricia, calling with her own version of helpful suggestions for Audrey's retirement. "Mother, I've been thinking about your transition, and I have some wonderful ideas for how you could stay involved without the burden of actual decision-making." Audrey almost laughed at the phrase, burden of actual decision-making, as if the strategic thinking and problem-solving that had energized her for decades were now obstacles to her happiness. "I'm listening, Patricia." "Well, you could be our official company ambassador, attending social events, representing us at charity functions, that sort of thing. It would let you use your people skills without having to worry about the technical business aspects." Audrey noted that Patricia, like Richard, seemed to believe that relationship building and community engagement were somehow separate from real business skills, rather than essential components of effective leadership. "And of course," Patricia continued, "we'd love for you to stay involved with the charitable foundation. That's really where your heart is anyway, and it would free up the rest of us to focus on growing the business." The charitable foundation that Patricia was so generously allowing her to continue managing was something Audrey had built from nothing, growing it into a multi-million-dollar operation that had transformed countless lives. But Patricia presented this as if she were offering Audrey a consolation prize, a way to feel useful while the real work was handled by more capable people. "Patricia, the foundation has always been integrated with our business strategy. Community investment creates customer loyalty, employee pride, and market differentiation. It's not separate from business growth. It's essential to it." Well, yes, of course it has some business benefits. But let's be honest, the amounts we donate could be put to more direct use in research and development, or marketing, or executive recruitment. The return on investment for charitable giving is pretty questionable. Audrey felt as if she were speaking a foreign language. Patricia was reducing community engagement to a simple cost-benefit analysis, completely missing the deeper connections between corporate citizenship and long-term success. "Patricia, do you remember when the factory in Texas was damaged by flooding 3 years ago?" "Of course. We had to shut down production for 2 weeks." "Do you remember how we got back online so quickly?" There was a pause. "I assume our insurance covered the repairs." "The insurance covered the building damage, but it didn't cover the fact that half our workers had lost their homes in the same flood. We were able to resume production ahead of schedule because the emergency fund we had established helped our employees get back on their feet. They worked overtime to make up for lost production because they knew we cared about them as people, not just as labor units." "Well, yes, that worked out well, but it was expensive, and we were lucky it didn't happen again." "It wasn't luck, Patricia, it was strategy. Investing in our employees and our community creates resilience and loyalty that no amount of cost-cutting can replace." "I suppose that's one way to look at it. But there are more efficient ways to ensure productivity and loyalty." Audrey realized that Patricia saw employee loyalty as something that could be purchased more cheaply through other means, rather than something that grew from genuine mutual respect and care. The conversation ended with Patricia promising to send her some articles about modern human resources practices, as if Audrey had never considered that employee relations might evolve over time. The final conversation came that afternoon, when Michael stopped by the house to pick up some mail that had been delivered to the main residence instead of the guest house. Audrey was in the garden, tending to the roses that bordered the back patio, when he found her. "Hey, Mom, beautiful day for gardening," he said, settling into one of the wrought iron chairs that overlooked the flower beds. Audrey looked up from her pruning, noting the casual way Michael made himself comfortable without offering to help. Yes, it's peaceful out here. How are your job interviews going, sweetheart? Michael's expression shifted slightly. Actually, I've been thinking about that. You know, with the company transition happening, maybe it makes more sense for me to focus on family business opportunities instead of looking for outside employment. Audrey continued pruning, keeping her voice neutral. What kind of family business opportunities? Well, legal consulting, for one thing. Simpson Technologies could probably benefit from having in-house legal counsel instead of outsourcing everything to expensive law firms. Audrey knew that Simpson Technologies already had a perfectly competent legal department and established relationships with specialized firms for complex matters. Michael's suggestion seemed motivated more by a desire to avoid job hunting than by any genuine business need. And beyond legal consulting? Investment management, business development, maybe some strategic planning. I have an MBA, along with a law degree. I could probably contribute more to the family business than I could to some random company. Audrey set down her pruning shears and gave Michael her full attention. Michael, what kind of contribution are you envisioning? Well, obviously I'd need to get up to speed on current operations, but I think I could bring a fresh perspective to things. Maybe help modernize some of the outdated approaches. There was that word again, outdated. Audrey was beginning to recognize it as her children's favorite criticism of her leadership style. What approaches do you see as outdated? Michael shifted in his chair, apparently uncomfortable with being asked for specifics. Just general business philosophy stuff. Like, some of the decisions seem to be based more on feelings than on hard financial analysis. Can you give me an example? Well, like the scholarship program. It's nice that we help kids go to college, but what's the actual return on that investment? Those kids don't owe us anything after graduation. Most of them probably don't even remember that Simpson Technologies funded their education. Audrey thought about the dozens of letters she received each year from scholarship recipients, thanking her for making their dreams possible and describing how their education had changed their families' futures. She thought about the young engineers and business managers who had joined Simpson Technologies after graduation, bringing fresh ideas and passionate commitment to the company that had invested in their potential. Michael, do you think there might be returns that aren't immediately measurable in financial terms? I suppose, but from a business perspective, we have to focus on quantifiable outcomes. Spending money on programs that make us feel good but don't demonstrably improve our bottom line is basically a luxury we can't afford in a competitive market. Audrey realized that Michael, like his siblings, saw community investment as an indulgence rather than a strategic necessity. They had inherited her wealth, but none of her wisdom about how that wealth had been created and sustained. What about employee satisfaction and retention? The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Audrey's home office as she sat before her computer, a steaming cup of Earl Grey tea growing cold beside her, as she scrolled through email after email from scholarship recipients. Each message was a small window into a life that had been transformed, a future that had been made possible, a dream that had been realized through the educational grants she had established over the years. Maria Gonzalez had written from Stanford, where she was completing her PhD in biomedical engineering. The daughter of a janitor and a seamstress, Maria had received a Simpson Technologies scholarship that covered not just tuition but living expenses, allowing her to focus on her studies without working multiple jobs like her parents had done their entire lives. Her research on prosthetic limbs was on the verge of a breakthrough that could help thousands of amputees regain mobility. James Patterson had sent photos from his graduation ceremony at MIT, where he had earned a degree in computer science. Raised by his grandmother in a neighborhood where college seemed like an impossible dream, James had used his Simpson scholarship to become a software engineer, who was now developing applications to help elderly people stay connected with their families during the pandemic. Sarah Chen's letter came from Johns Hopkins, where she was in her final year of medical school. The daughter of immigrants who ran a small restaurant, Sarah had always dreamed of becoming a doctor but knew her family could never afford medical school. The Simpson scholarship had made that dream possible, and she was planning to return to her hometown to work in the community clinic that served low-income families. Audrey read each message carefully, responding personally to everyone, remembering details about their backgrounds, and asking about their progress. These young people understood the value of opportunity, the power of education, and the responsibility that came with having someone believe in their potential. They wrote about their gratitude not as an obligation, but as a driving force that motivated them to excel and give back to their communities. As she finished responding to the morning's emails, Audrey's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Helen Foster, the principal of Roosevelt Elementary School, located in one of the city's most economically challenged neighborhoods. Audrey had been supporting the school's programs for over a decade, funding everything from updated computer labs to after-school tutoring programs. "Audrey, I hope I'm not calling too early," Dr. Foster said, her voice carrying the warmth that had made her beloved by students and parents alike. "I wanted to share some wonderful news about our reading program." Audrey leaned back in her chair, genuinely interested. "Please, tell me everything." "Well, you know how we've been struggling with reading comprehension scores, especially among our 3rd and 4th graders. The additional tutoring staff we were able to hire with your grant has made an incredible difference. Our latest test scores show a 38% improvement in reading levels across those grades." Audrey felt a familiar surge of satisfaction, the same feeling she had experienced when closing a major business deal or launching a successful product line. "That's remarkable, Helen. What do the teachers think is making the difference?" "It's the individual attention, really. With smaller groups, the tutors can identify exactly where each child is struggling and tailor their approach. We have kids who were reading at a 1st grade level who are now catching up to their peers. It's transformational." Dr. Foster went on to describe specific success stories. Tommy Rodriguez, whose parents worked 2 jobs each and couldn't help with homework, was now reading chapter books independently. Ashley Williams, who had been held back a grade due to reading difficulties, was not only caught up, but exceeding grade-level expectations. Marcus Johnson, who had been acting out in class because he was frustrated by his inability to keep up, was now one of the most engaged students in his classroom. "These children aren't just improving academically," Dr. Foster explained. "Their confidence is growing, their behavior is improving, and they're starting to see themselves as successful students instead of struggling ones. The ripple effects go far beyond reading scores." After ending the call, Audrey sat quietly in her office, thinking about the contrast between her children's dismissive attitude toward charitable giving and the profound impact she had witnessed firsthand. To Richard, Patricia, and Michael, the money spent on programs like the Roosevelt Elementary Tutoring Initiative was simply capital that could have been invested more profitably elsewhere. They saw charitable giving as an emotional indulgence that reduced shareholder returns. But Audrey understood something her children had failed to grasp, despite growing up surrounded by evidence of it. The reading program at Roosevelt Elementary wasn't just helping individual children. It was building human capital, strengthening communities, and creating future leaders, innovators, and contributors to society. The return on investment wasn't measurable in quarterly reports, but it was real and substantial nonetheless. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Carmen Santos, the director of the Westchester Community Center. Carmen had called the previous day asking if she could stop by to discuss an urgent situation, and Audrey had invited her for coffee. Carmen entered the office carrying a thick folder and wearing the expression of someone who was trying to remain optimistic in the face of significant challenges. At 45, she had dedicated her career to serving families in need, and her passion for the work was evident in every conversation Audrey had ever had with her. "Audrey, thank you so much for seeing me on such short notice," Carmen said, settling into the comfortable chair across from Audrey's desk. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news about our funding situation." Audrey poured coffee from the service she had prepared and gave Carmen her full attention. "What's happening?" Carmen opened her folder and spread several documents across the desk. "The state has cut funding for youth programs by 40%, effective at the end of this fiscal year. The federal grants we were counting on have been eliminated entirely. We're looking at a budget shortfall of nearly $300,000. Audrey studied the financial projections Carmen had prepared, noting the careful documentation and realistic assumptions. Carmen ran the community center with the same attention to fiscal responsibility that Audrey applied to her business operations. "What programs would be affected?" Audrey asked. Potentially all of them, Carmen said, her voice heavy with the weight of the implications. The after-school program serves 200 children whose parents work late shifts. The job training program has helped over 50 adults get stable employment in the past year. The senior center provides meals and social interaction for elderly residents who would otherwise be isolated. The food pantry serves nearly 100 families every month. Carmen continued describing the programs that would be lost, painting a picture of a community support system that was on the verge of collapse due to funding cuts. Audrey found herself thinking about the families who depended on these services, particularly the children who would have nowhere safe to go after school if the programs were eliminated. What would it take to keep everything running? Audrey asked. Carmen looked surprised by the directness of the question. Well, ideally, we'd need to replace the lost government funding entirely. That would be about $300,000 annually. But honestly, we'd be grateful for any help that would allow us to maintain even some of our core programs. Audrey made notes as Carmen explained the center's funding model and the impact of various potential scenarios. The conversation reminded her of countless business meetings where she had evaluated investment opportunities, except in this case, the return on investment was measured in changed lives rather than financial returns. Carmen, what would happen to the families you serve if the center had to close? Carmen's expression grew somber. The children would probably end up unsupervised after school, which increases risks of academic failure, behavioral problems, and involvement with negative influences. The adults would lose access to job training and employment resources, making it harder for them to improve their economic situations. The seniors would become more isolated, which has serious health consequences. The families using the food pantry would struggle even more with food insecurity. As Carmen spoke, Audrey realized she was describing exactly the kind of community breakdown that occurred when support systems were eliminated in favor of short-term cost savings. It was the human equivalent of Richard's proposal to close the Ohio manufacturing plant to improve quarterly profits, without considering the long-term consequences for employee loyalty, community relationships, and brand reputation. I'll need to review this information carefully, Audrey told Carmen, but I want you to know that I'm very interested in helping find a solution. Carmen's face lit up with hope. Audrey, you've already been so generous over the years. The new playground equipment, the computer lab renovation, the scholarship fund for our college-bound students. We can't ask you to solve every problem we face. You're not asking me to solve every problem, Audrey replied. You're giving me an opportunity to invest in something that creates real value for our community. After Carmen left, Audrey spent the afternoon reviewing the community center's proposals and financial documents. The thoroughness of Carmen's preparation impressed her. Every program was documented with clear goals, measurable outcomes, and detailed budget projections. It was exactly the kind of strategic planning that Audrey had always required in her business operations. But more than the financial details, Audrey was struck by the scope of the community center's impact. The after-school program didn't just provide supervision for children. It included homework help, art classes, sports activities, and mentorship programs that built character and confidence. The job training program didn't just teach technical skills. It included resume writing, interview preparation, and ongoing support that helped participants maintain employment. The senior program didn't just provide meals. It offered social interaction, health screenings, and assistance with navigating healthcare and social services. Each program was designed to address multiple interconnected challenges, creating a comprehensive support system that strengthened the entire community. It was exactly the kind of holistic, long-term thinking that her children dismissed as inefficient and outdated. Audrey's phone rang again, interrupting her analysis. This time the caller was Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the animal rescue organization that Audrey had been supporting for several years. Audrey, I hope you have a few minutes to talk, Dr. Walsh said. We're facing an unprecedented crisis, and I'm hoping you might be able to help us think through some options. Audrey had always been moved by the work of the animal rescue organization, which not only cared for abandoned and abused animals, but also provided low-cost veterinary services for families who couldn't afford private care. The organization's approach combined immediate animal welfare with community education and support programs. What kind of crisis are you dealing with? Audrey asked. We've been overwhelmed by the number of animals being surrendered due to economic hardship. Pet owners who have lost jobs or housing can't afford to care for their animals anymore, so they're bringing them to us. At the same time, adoptions have slowed down because fewer people feel financially secure enough to take on the responsibility of pet ownership. Dr. Walsh explained that the rescue organization was currently caring for nearly twice as many animals as their facilities were designed to handle. The increased costs for food, medical care, and staffing were straining their budget beyond its limits. "How are you managing the overcrowding?" Audrey asked. "We've converted every available space into temporary housing, but it's not sustainable. Animals are stressed, which leads to behavioral and health problems. Our staff is working longer hours, which increases the risk of burnout and mistakes. We're turning away animals that desperately need help because we simply don't have space or resources." As Dr. Walsh described the situation, Audrey found herself thinking about the interconnected nature of community challenges. Economic hardship led to pet surrenders, which overwhelmed rescue organizations, which reduced their ability to provide services to low-income families, which created more hardship and more surrenders. It was a cycle that could only be broken by addressing the underlying issues rather than just managing the symptoms. "What would it take to adequately address the current crisis?" Audrey asked. "Ideally, we need to expand our facilities and increase our capacity for both animal care and community support programs. We're looking at about $200,000 for facility improvements and an additional $100,000 annually for expanded programming." Dr. Walsh went on to describe their vision for a comprehensive approach that would include not just animal rescue but also emergency veterinary assistance for struggling families, pet food banks, and educational programs that would help prevent future surrenders. "The goal isn't just to rescue more animals," Dr. Walsh explained. "It's to build a support system that helps families keep their pets when they're going through difficult times, which reduces the number of animals that need rescuing in the first place." After ending the call, Audrey added Dr. Walsh's proposal to the growing stack of funding requests on her desk. Each organization had approached her independently, but she was beginning to see connections between their missions and their challenges. The community center's programs helped families achieve economic stability, which reduced the likelihood that they would have to surrender pets. The educational scholarships created opportunities for young people to build careers that would allow them to contribute to their communities. The school tutoring programs gave children the academic foundation they needed to pursue higher education. Each initiative was part of a larger ecosystem of community support, and Audrey realized that her children's dismissive attitude toward charitable giving reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how communities functioned and how sustainable prosperity was created. As evening approached, Audrey received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Chen, her attorney, called to say she was in the neighborhood and asked if she could stop by to discuss some legal questions that had come up regarding Audrey's estate planning. Margaret arrived carrying a briefcase and wearing the thoughtful expression that Audrey had learned to associate with complex legal challenges. They settled in Audrey's study, a comfortable room lined with bookshelves and family photographs. "Audrey, I've been thinking about our last conversation regarding your succession planning," Margaret said. "I want to make sure I understand your current intentions for the business and your personal assets." Audrey had been working with Margaret for over 15 years, and she trusted the attorney's judgment completely. Margaret had helped her navigate numerous legal challenges over the years, always providing not just technical expertise but strategic thinking about the long-term implications of various decisions. "I'm still evaluating my options," Audrey said carefully. "The conversations I've had with my children have made me realize that their vision for the company's future may not align with my values." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Can you be more specific about those differences?" Audrey described the conversations she had overheard and participated in over the past few weeks, explaining how her children viewed her commitment to employee welfare and community investment as obstacles to business efficiency rather than essential components of sustainable success. "They seem to believe that my approaches are outdated and that the company would be more profitable if they focused exclusively on cost reduction and revenue maximization," Audrey concluded. Margaret took notes as Audrey spoke, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific policies or programs that might be at risk under new management. "Audrey, I need to ask you a difficult question," Margaret said. Are you concerned that your children might not be the right people to inherit control of Simpson Technologies? The question hung in the air between them, forcing Audrey to confront a possibility she had been reluctant to fully acknowledge. She had always assumed that her children would eventually take over the business, but those assumptions had been based on the belief that they shared her fundamental values about responsibility, community engagement, and ethical leadership. I'm concerned that they see the business as a vehicle for personal enrichment rather than as a platform for positive impact, Audrey said slowly. They've made it clear that they consider my approaches to be sentimental and inefficient. Margaret leaned forward in her chair. What outcome would you prefer to see? Audrey thought about the question for several minutes, considering not just her immediate disappointment with her children's attitudes, but her long-term hopes for the company's impact on employees, customers, and the broader community. I want Simpson Technologies to continue being a force for positive change, she said finally. I want it to provide good jobs for people who are willing to work hard, to develop products that improve people's lives, and to contribute to the communities where we operate. If my children aren't committed to those goals, then perhaps they shouldn't inherit control of the company. Margaret made more notes, then looked up with a serious expression. Audrey, there are several legal mechanisms that could ensure the company continues to operate according to your values, regardless of who inherits ownership. We could establish a foundation that maintains voting control, create legally binding requirements for charitable giving and employee welfare, or structure the inheritance in ways that incentivize behavior that aligns with your priorities. As Margaret explained various options, Audrey realized that she had more control over her legacy than she had initially understood. She didn't have to simply hope that her children would honor her values. She could create legal structures that would require them to do so. There's another option we should discuss, Margaret continued. If you're truly concerned about your children's stewardship of the company, you could consider alternative inheritance strategies that reward their commitment to your values, or redirect assets to other beneficiaries who would use them more effectively. The suggestion was radical, but Audrey found herself surprisingly open to considering it. Her children had made it clear that they considered her values to be obstacles, rather than assets. Perhaps it was time to entrust her legacy to people who would recognize its true worth. What would that look like practically? Audrey asked. Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out several legal documents. I took the liberty of researching some possibilities after our last conversation. You could establish a foundation that would receive the majority of your assets and use them to support causes you care about. You could create scholarship endowments, fund community programs, or support organizations that align with your values. As Margaret outlined various scenarios, Audrey felt a growing sense of excitement. Instead of hoping that her children would eventually understand the importance of her philanthropic work, she could ensure that her resources would be used to maximum effect by people who already shared her commitment to positive change. The beauty of this approach, Margaret explained, is that it allows you to see the impact of your giving while you're still alive. Instead of leaving money to organizations through your will, you could begin making transformational donations immediately and be actively involved in how they're used. Audrey thought about Carmen's funding crisis at the community center, Dr. Walsh's overcrowded animal rescue, the scholarship recipients who were changing the world through their education, and the countless other opportunities to create positive change that presented themselves every day. Margaret, I want you to prepare several different scenarios, Audrey said. I want to understand exactly what my options are, and what the implications would be for my children, for the business, and for the organizations I want to support. Margaret smiled, clearly energized by the challenge. I'll have preliminary drafts ready for your review within the week. This is exactly the kind of strategic philanthropy that can create lasting change. After Margaret left, Audrey remained in her study, surrounded by the photographs and mementos that documented her life's journey. Pictures of her late husband, images from company milestones, awards recognizing her business and philanthropic achievements, and family photos that captured happier times when she had believed her children shared her values. As she looked at those family photos, Audrey felt a deep sadness for the relationships that had been damaged by her children's casual dismissal of everything she had worked to build. But alongside the sadness, she felt something else, a growing sense of purpose and possibility. If her children truly believed she had nothing to offer, then perhaps it was time to offer everything she had to people who would use it to build the kind of world she had always envisioned. The transformation that would shock her family was beginning to take shape, and Audrey Simpson was discovering that the most powerful response to being undervalued was to demonstrate her true worth in ways that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. The phone calls continued throughout the following weeks, each one reinforcing Audrey's growing understanding of the impact her philanthropy could have if she approached it with the same strategic thinking she had applied to business challenges. Dr. Rachel Martinez from the regional hospital called to discuss their need for updated medical equipment in the pediatric ward. Professor David Kim from the community college described their plans for a new STEM program that would prepare students for high-tech careers. Sarah Thompson from the women's shelter outlined their expansion plans to serve more families escaping domestic violence. Each conversation revealed not just immediate needs, but long-term opportunities to address systemic challenges through thoughtful investment. Audrey found herself energized by these discussions in ways that her recent conversations with her children had not energized her. These were people who understood the connection between immediate action and long-term impact, who appreciated the strategic value of comprehensive approaches to community challenges. As she compiled information from various organizations, Audrey began to see the outline of a comprehensive philanthropic strategy that could transform her community in measurable, sustainable ways. It was the kind of legacy project that would have excited her husband, who had always believed that business success created an obligation to contribute to the greater good. But more than that, it was a way to demonstrate definitively that she had everything to offer to people who were ready to receive it and use it effectively. The question was no longer whether her children valued her contributions, but whether she was ready to entrust her life's work to people who would honor it properly. The answer was becoming clearer every day. The confrontation Audrey had been dreading arrived on a crisp Thursday morning in October, precisely 6 weeks after she had begun quietly restructuring her financial affairs. She was in her home office, reviewing the final drafts of legal documents that would fundamentally alter her family's future, when she heard the familiar sound of Richard's BMW pulling into her driveway. Through her window, she watched all 3 of her children emerge from Richard's car, their faces grim with purpose. Patricia carried a manila folder thick with documents. Michael had his laptop bag slung over his shoulder, and Richard wore the expression of someone preparing for an unpleasant but necessary business meeting. Audrey had been expecting this moment ever since Margaret Chen had informed her that certain financial transactions required notification of potential heirs. The children had clearly received those notifications and drawn their own conclusions about what they meant. The doorbell rang with unusual persistence, followed by Richard's voice calling through the front door. "Mother, we need to talk. We know you're home." Audrey took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and walked to the front door with the calm dignity of someone who had spent months preparing for this exact moment. When she opened the door, she was struck by how much her children looked like strangers to her now, their faces hard with a determination she had never seen before. "Richard, Patricia, Michael," she said with polite formality. "This is unexpected. Please, come in." They filed into the living room, the same space where she had celebrated her retirement just months earlier, when she had still believed that her children would honor her legacy and build upon her life's work. Now the room felt like a courtroom, with her children taking positions that suggested they had planned this intervention carefully. Richard, as the eldest, appointed himself spokesperson. "Mother, we've received some very disturbing information from our attorneys about recent changes to your financial arrangements. We're hoping you can help us understand what's happening." Audrey settled into her favorite armchair, the one that had belonged to her late husband, and regarded her children with steady composure. "What specifically would you like to know?" Patricia opened her folder and pulled out several legal documents. "We've been informed that you've established a charitable foundation and transferred significant assets into its control. We've also learned that you've been liquidating investments and restructuring your estate in ways that could dramatically affect our inheritance." Audrey noted that Patricia's first concern was the effect on their inheritance rather than any curiosity about her motivations or the purposes of the foundation. "Yes, I have established the Simpson Community Foundation. It seemed like an appropriate way to ensure that my resources continue to create positive impact after I'm gone. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his voice carrying a note of barely controlled frustration. Mom, you can't just give away our inheritance without consulting us. We're your children. We have a right to be involved in decisions that affect our family's financial future. The phrase, our inheritance, struck Audrey as revealing. Michael seemed to believe that her assets belonged to them already, that she was merely a temporary custodian of wealth that rightfully belonged to her children. It was an attitude that explained much about their casual dismissal of her business judgment and philanthropic priorities. Michael, my assets belong to me until I choose to dispose of them, Audrey said calmly. I've spent considerable time thinking about how to use those resources most effectively. Richard's voice took on the patronizing tone he had been using with increasing frequency in recent months. Mother, we understand that you want to be generous, but you need to think about this more carefully. Charitable giving is fine in moderation, but what you're proposing goes far beyond reasonable limits. Audrey found herself curious about Richard's definition of reasonable limits for charitable giving, especially given his earlier dismissal of her community investments as inefficient business practices. What would you consider reasonable, Richard? Well, maybe 5 or 10% of your total assets. Enough to maintain your reputation for community involvement without jeopardizing our family's financial security. Patricia nodded in agreement. Richard's right. Charity is important, but family comes first. You have an obligation to ensure that your children and grandchildren are provided for before you start giving money away to strangers. Audrey thought about the scholarship recipients she had been corresponding with, young people whose talents and potential had been unlocked by educational opportunities they couldn't have afforded otherwise. In Patricia's worldview, those young people were strangers, whose dreams and futures mattered less than her children's desire for inherited wealth they had done nothing to earn. Patricia, what do you think I owe you as your mother? The question seemed to surprise Patricia, who had apparently expected the conversation to focus on financial technicalities, rather than fundamental questions about family obligation and responsibility. Well, obviously you owe us love and support, and that includes financial support. You owe us the security that comes from knowing our family's wealth will be preserved and passed down to the next generation. Audrey realized that Patricia saw inheritance not as a gift or privilege, but as a form of debt that parents owed their children simply by virtue of having brought them into the world. It was a perspective that transformed her life's work into something that belonged to her children, rather than something she had created through her own effort and judgment. And what do you think you owe me in return? Audrey asked. The question hung in the air uncomfortably. Richard, Patricia, and Michael exchanged glances, clearly struggling with a concept they had never seriously considered. Michael was the first to attempt an answer. We owe you respect, obviously. And love. And we owe it to you to use our inheritance responsibly. How do you define using it responsibly? Growing it, preserving it, making sure it continues to benefit our family for generations to come, Michael said, as if the answer were obvious. Audrey noted that Michael's definition of responsibility focused entirely on wealth preservation and accumulation, with no mention of the values or principles that had guided her in building that wealth in the first place. Michael, when you say you owe me respect, what does that mean to you? Again, the question seemed to catch him off guard. It means listening to your advice, honoring your memory after you're gone, that sort of thing. Does it mean respecting the values and principles that guided my decisions throughout my life? Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mother, we respect your values, but we also think it's important to adapt to changing circumstances. The business world today is different from what it was when you started the company. Audrey had heard this argument many times over the past few months, always presented as if her experience were a liability rather than an asset, as if the principles that had guided her success were outdated rather than timeless. Richard, which of my values do you think are no longer relevant? The question forced Richard to be more specific than he had been in previous conversations, and Audrey could see him calculating how much honesty the situation required. Well, for example, your emphasis on employee welfare over profit maximization. That might have worked in a smaller, more personal business environment, but it's not sustainable in today's competitive global marketplace. And your emphasis on community investment over shareholder returns, Patricia added. It's admirable in theory, but it reduces the resources available for business growth and family security. Michael nodded in agreement. Plus, the whole idea that business owners have some kind of special obligation to solve social problems. That's what government programs are for. Our job should be to create wealth, not to redistribute it. As Audrey listened to her children systematically dismiss every principle that had guided her life and career, she felt a strange sense of relief. Their casual rejection of her values removed any remaining doubt about the decision she had been contemplating for weeks. I see, Audrey said quietly. So you believe that my approaches to business and philanthropy have been misguided? Not misguided exactly, Richard said quickly, apparently realizing that he had gone further than he intended. Just not optimal for current conditions. Patricia leaned forward, adopting a tone she probably thought was reassuring. Mother, we're not criticizing what you've accomplished. You built a very successful business, and we're grateful for that. We're just saying that it's time for fresh thinking. Modern approaches. Fresh thinking that would eliminate the employee welfare programs, community investments, and charitable giving that have been central to Simpson Technologies' identity for 45 years? The question made all three children visibly uncomfortable, forcing them to acknowledge the full implications of their proposed modernization. Mother, you're being dramatic, Michael said. We're not talking about eliminating everything. We're talking about optimizing the allocation of resources to maximize returns. And what would those optimized allocations look like? Richard pulled out his laptop and opened a presentation he had apparently prepared for this conversation. We've done some preliminary analysis of potential improvements to company operations and financial performance. The presentation that followed was a systematic dismantling of everything Audrey had built. Richard's optimizations included closing the Ohio manufacturing plant and moving production overseas, eliminating the scholarship program and redirecting those funds to executive compensation, cutting the community investment budget by 75%, and reducing employee benefits to industry minimums. These changes would increase annual profits by approximately 30%, Richard concluded, as if the financial projections vindicated the human costs of his proposals. Patricia added her own suggestions for optimizing Audrey's personal philanthropy. Instead of supporting dozens of small organizations with modest donations, you could focus on a few high-profile charities that would enhance our family's social standing. Strategic giving that creates networking opportunities and business connections. Michael's contribution focused on tax optimization strategies that would minimize their inheritance obligations while maximizing the wealth available for their personal use. We could establish offshore trusts, create family-limited partnerships, maybe even explore citizenship options in countries with more favorable tax structures. As Audrey listened to their presentation, she realized that her children had spent considerable time and effort developing plans to undo her life's work in the name of efficiency and optimization. They had reduced her legacy to a series of financial calculations, stripping away the human impact and community benefit that had always been her primary motivation. Your plans are very thorough, Audrey said when they finished. You've clearly put a lot of thought into how to reshape Simpson Technologies and redirect my charitable giving. Richard smiled, apparently interpreting her comment as approval. We want to honor your legacy while adapting to contemporary realities. The goal is to build on what you've created, not to abandon it. But everything you've described would abandon it, Audrey said quietly. Closing plants, eliminating employee benefits, ending community programs, redirecting charitable funds to serve your social ambitions rather than community needs. How is that building on my legacy? Patricia's voice took on an edge of impatience. Mother, legacy isn't about maintaining every specific program or policy you've ever implemented. Legacy is about the overall impact, the family name, the business success. We can honor your memory while making the changes necessary to ensure continued prosperity. Audrey realized that Patricia saw legacy as a brand management exercise rather than a continuation of values and principles. In her view, Honoring Audrey's memory was compatible with abandoning everything Audrey had worked to achieve. Patricia, what do you think my overall impact has been? The question seemed to surprise Patricia, who had apparently expected the conversation to remain focused on financial and operational details. Well, you built a successful business that provides for our family and creates jobs for thousands of people. That's an important contribution. And beyond that, Patricia looked uncomfortable. I suppose the charitable work has been meaningful to you personally. Audrey noted that Patricia characterized her community investments as personally meaningful, rather than objectively valuable, as if the scholarships, community programs, and organizational support were hobbies, rather than strategic initiatives that had transformed countless lives. Richard, how would you describe my impact? Richard was more diplomatic than his sister, but his underlying perspective was similar. You've been a respected business leader and a generous community supporter. You've shown that success creates opportunities to help others. Michael's answer was the most revealing. You've proven that hard work and smart decisions can create significant wealth. You've shown our family what's possible when you focus on building something valuable. Each of her children had reduced her life's work to its most superficial elements. They saw the wealth she had created, but ignored the values that had guided its creation. They acknowledged her community involvement, but dismissed its strategic importance. They recognized her business success, but rejected the principles that had made that success sustainable and meaningful. I want to share something with you, Audrey said, reaching for a folder she had prepared for this conversation. Over the past few weeks, I've been receiving reports from various organizations about the impact of my charitable giving. She opened the folder and began reading from the documents inside. Maria Gonzalez had been accepted into a prestigious research program that could lead to breakthroughs in prosthetic technology. The Roosevelt Elementary Reading Program had achieved the highest improvement scores in the district's history. The Community Center's job training program had a 93% placement rate, with participants earning an average of 40% more than they had in their previous positions. The Animal Rescue Organization has reduced euthanasia rates by 60%, while increasing adoptions by 80%, Audrey continued. The Women's Shelter has expanded to serve twice as many families, with a 75% success rate in helping women achieve independence from abusive relationships. As she read each success story, Audrey watched her children's faces. They listened politely, but she could see their impatience with what they clearly regarded as irrelevant sentimentality. These stories of transformed lives and strengthened communities meant nothing to them compared to the potential financial returns they were foregoing. Mother, that's all very nice, Richard said when she finished. But you have to understand that those kinds of programs can be maintained at much lower funding levels. You don't need to sacrifice our family's financial security to achieve modest improvements in community services. Patricia nodded in agreement. Plus, there are other wealthy families in the area who could pick up some of the slack if you reduced your giving. It's not fair for you to carry the entire burden of local charity. Michael's contribution was the most direct. Mom, I know this stuff makes you feel good, but feeling good isn't a good enough reason to give away millions of dollars that could benefit your own family. Audrey closed the folder and looked at each of her children in turn, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time in their adult lives. They were intelligent, educated, and capable people who had been given every advantage in life. But they had also become people who measured value exclusively in financial terms, who saw community investment as wasteful sentiment, and who believed that family wealth should be preserved and accumulated rather than used to create positive change. I have one more thing to share with you, Audrey said, reaching for a second folder that contained the documents Margaret Chen had prepared. These are the final papers establishing the Simpson Community Foundation and transferring the majority of my assets to its control. The silence that followed was profound. Richard's face went pale. Patricia's mouth opened in shock, and Michael looked as if he had been physically struck. The foundation will be governed by a board that includes representatives from the organizations I've been supporting, along with community leaders who understand the importance of strategic philanthropy, Audrey continued. The goal is to create sustainable funding for programs that address systemic challenges in education, economic development, healthcare, and social services. Richard found his voice first. Mother, you can't be serious. You're talking about giving away our entire inheritance. I'm talking about using my assets to create the kind of impact I've always wanted to create, Audrey replied. The foundation will be able to fund programs at levels that can actually solve problems rather than just managing them. Patricia's voice was shaking with emotion. This is insane. You're destroying our family's future because you're angry about some disagreement over business strategy. I'm not angry, Patricia. I'm disappointed, but I'm not angry. I'm simply making decisions based on my values and priorities. Michael stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Mom, think about what you're doing. Think about Sophie and Emma, about the grandchildren you might have in the future. Are you really going to leave them with nothing because you disagree with our business plans? The mention of her granddaughters was clearly intended to be emotional manipulation, but it also revealed how fundamentally Michael misunderstood her motivations. He assumed that her decision was based on spite or disappointment, rather than on a clear-eyed assessment of how her resources could be used most effectively. Michael, I'm not leaving them with nothing. I'm creating a world where they can grow up in a community with excellent schools, comprehensive social services, and opportunities for everyone to succeed based on their effort and talent, rather than their inherited wealth. Richard's voice took on a desperate edge. Mother, please think about this more carefully. You're making a decision that can't be undone. Once you've given the money away, it's gone forever. Richard, money given away thoughtfully isn't gone. It's transformed into something more valuable than financial assets. It becomes opportunity, education, healthcare, and hope for people who need it most. Patricia tried a different approach. Mother, what if we compromised? What if we agreed to maintain some level of charitable giving while still preserving the majority of the estate for family inheritance? What level would you consider appropriate? Audrey asked. Maybe 25%? Patricia suggested. That would still be a very generous contribution while ensuring that our family remains financially secure. Audrey realized that Patricia was offering to allow her to give away 25% of her own money, as if Patricia had some claim to control how those assets were used. The generosity of permitting Audrey to donate a quarter of her wealth was apparently supposed to demonstrate their willingness to compromise. And the remaining 75% would be used according to your business and investment strategies? Audrey asked. Exactly, Richard said, apparently relieved that they were finally negotiating. We could work together to develop a comprehensive plan that honors your values while maximizing returns for the family. A plan that would close the Ohio plant, eliminate the scholarship program, reduce employee benefits, and redirect community investments to executive compensation and offshore tax shelters. The directness of the question made all three children uncomfortable, forcing them to acknowledge that their version of honoring her values involved abandoning those values entirely. Mother, those are operational details that we can discuss separately, Richard said. The important thing is to preserve the family's wealth and ensure that future generations have the resources they need to succeed. Audrey stood up from her chair, signaling that the conversation was moving toward its conclusion. Richard, I want you to understand something very clearly. I have spent 45 years building wealth not for its own sake, but as a tool for creating positive change. You've made it clear that you see that wealth as an end in itself, something to be preserved and accumulated rather than used for its intended purpose. She moved to the mantelpiece, where family photographs documented decades of shared experiences that now felt like artifacts from a different life. You've told me directly that you consider my values outdated, my business judgment irrelevant, and my philanthropic priorities wasteful. You've concluded that I have nothing to offer except money, and you've made it clear that you plan to use that money in ways that contradict everything I've worked to achieve. Patricia started to interrupt, but Audrey continued without pause. So I've decided to offer my wealth to people who will use it according to my values and priorities. People who understand that financial resources are tools for building stronger communities, creating opportunities for others, and addressing the challenges that prevent people from achieving their potential. Michael's voice was pleading now. Mom, we love you. We respect what you've accomplished. We just think there are more efficient ways to help people while still taking care of our family. Michael, if you truly respected what I've accomplished, you would want to continue building on it rather than dismantling it. If you truly loved me, you would care about preserving the values and principles that have guided my life, rather than abandoning them for short-term financial gain. Richard made one final attempt to change her mind. Mother, I'm begging you to reconsider. Think about everything our family could accomplish with those resources. Think about the legacy you could leave through us. Audrey turned to face her 3 children, seeing them clearly for who they had become, rather than who she had hoped they would be. Richard, I have thought about the legacy I want to leave. I want to leave a legacy of compassion, generosity, and commitment to using privilege responsibly. You've made it clear that those values are not important to you. So I'm entrusting my legacy to people who will honor it. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of Patricia crying quietly. Audrey felt a deep sadness for the relationships that had been damaged by this confrontation, but she also felt a profound sense of peace about the decision she had made. The foundation will officially launch next month, Audrey said quietly. You're welcome to apply for positions on the board if you're genuinely interested in supporting its mission, but I won't be changing my mind about how my assets are distributed. Richard, Patricia, and Michael left without another word, walking out of the house and out of Audrey's life with the same casual disregard they had shown for her values and accomplishments. As she watched their car disappear down the driveway, Audrey realized that she felt lighter than she had in months. For the first time since overhearing their conversation at her retirement party, she was no longer carrying the weight of their disappointment or trying to bridge the gap between their priorities and her own. She had chosen to align her resources with her values, and the relief of that alignment was profound. The transformation was complete. Audrey Simpson had moved from being an undervalued matriarch trying to please ungrateful children to being a strategic philanthropist ready to change the world. The people who would benefit from her decision understood its value in ways her own children never could. 6 months after the Simpson Community Foundation officially launched with a transformational $50 million endowment, Audrey stood in the newly renovated community center, watching Carmen Santos address a room full of local families whose lives had been fundamentally changed by the foundation's comprehensive approach to community development. The transformation of the center itself was remarkable. What had once been a cramped facility struggling to serve basic needs had become a vibrant community hub with state-of-the-art educational technology, expanded childcare facilities, a modern job training center, and a commercial kitchen that served both the nutrition program and a culinary arts training initiative. But the physical improvements were only the most visible sign of deeper changes that were rippling throughout the entire community. 18 months ago, I was working 2 part-time jobs without benefits, struggling to pay rent while trying to care for my elderly mother, said Diana Morales, addressing the gathering from behind a podium that bore the foundation's logo. Today, I'm a certified medical assistant working at the regional hospital with full benefits and a salary that allows my family to thrive rather than just survive. Diana's story was representative of dozens of similar transformations that had occurred, as the Foundation's programs created interconnected opportunities for community members to build stable, prosperous lives. The job training program didn't just teach technical skills, it included financial literacy, healthcare navigation, and ongoing mentorship that helped participants succeed in their new careers. Audrey watched from the back of the room as Diana introduced her teenage daughter, Sophia, who had received a Simpson Foundation scholarship to attend the state university, where she was studying environmental engineering. Sophia spoke about her plans to return to the community after graduation to work on sustainable development projects that would benefit the families who had supported her education. The foundation doesn't just help individuals, Sophia explained to the gathered audience. It helps families and communities build strength together. When my mom got stable employment, I could focus on my studies instead of working after school. When I succeed in college, I'll be able to contribute to solutions that help other families have the same opportunities we've had. The interconnected nature of the foundation's impact was exactly what Audrey had envisioned when she made the decision to redirect her wealth toward strategic philanthropy. Rather than simply funding isolated programs, the foundation had created a comprehensive ecosystem of support that addressed the underlying causes of economic instability and social challenges. Dr. Foster from Roosevelt Elementary approached Audrey during the reception that followed the program presentations. Audrey, I wanted you to know that our reading scores have continued to improve beyond anything we imagined possible. But more than that, we're seeing changes in the entire school culture. Dr. Foster explained that the Foundation's investment in tutoring programs had created a ripple effect throughout the school. Teachers who had been overwhelmed by large class sizes and diverse learning needs now had the support they needed to implement innovative teaching strategies. Students who had previously struggled academically were not only catching up, but becoming peer mentors for newer students facing similar challenges. We've gone from being a school that managed problems to being a school that creates solutions, Dr. Foster said. The confidence and competence our students are developing in elementary school is setting them up for success throughout their educational journey. As if to illustrate her point, Dr. Foster introduced Audrey to Marcus Johnson, the young man who had transformed from a disruptive student into one of the school's most engaged learners. Now in 7th grade, Marcus was participating in an advanced STEM program funded by the Foundation and had already expressed interest in becoming an engineer. "Mrs. Simpson, I wanted to thank you for believing in kids like me," Marcus said with the earnest formality of a young person who understood the significance of the opportunity he had been given. "When I was little, I thought I was just bad at school. Now I know I just needed different kinds of help to learn well." Marcus went on to describe his plans for high school and college, speaking with the confidence of someone who had learned to see himself as capable of achieving ambitious goals. His transformation from a struggling elementary student to a future engineer represented exactly the kind of long-term investment in human potential that Audrey had always believed was possible through strategic philanthropy. The evening's most powerful moment came when Carmen Santos invited Audrey to address the gathering. As she walked to the front of the room, Audrey was struck by the faces looking back at her. Scholarship recipients who were excelling in college, job training graduates who had found stable employment, families who had received emergency assistance during difficult times, and community leaders who had been empowered to expand their own work through foundation partnerships. "When I established this foundation," Audrey began, "I wanted to create something that would address not just immediate needs, but long-term opportunities for community development. Tonight, I see that vision becoming reality in ways that exceed even my most optimistic expectations." She paused, looking around the room at the evidence of what was possible when resources were invested thoughtfully in human potential and community strength. "But I also want you to know that this foundation isn't just my gift to the community, it's the community's gift to itself. Every success story we've heard tonight represents your hard work, your determination, and your commitment to building better lives for yourselves and your families." The audience's response was enthusiastic, but Audrey sensed that they understood the deeper meaning of her words. The foundation had provided resources and opportunities, but the community members themselves had done the difficult work of transformation and growth. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Animal Rescue Organization was among those who approached Audrey after her remarks. "Audrey, I have some incredible news about our expansion project. We've not only eliminated the overcrowding crisis, but we've actually been able to launch the preventive programs we dreamed about." Dr. Walsh explained that the Foundation's investment had allowed the organization to address pet surrender at its source by providing emergency veterinary care, temporary fostering during family crises, and pet food assistance for struggling families. The result had been a dramatic reduction in surrenders, combined with increased adoptions, as more families felt confident about their ability to provide long-term care for pets. "We've gone from being overwhelmed by crisis to being proactive about prevention," Dr. Walsh said. "The Foundation's support allowed us to think strategically about animal welfare rather than just reactively managing emergencies." The success stories continued throughout the evening, each one illustrating the multiplier effect of strategic philanthropy. The hospital's new pediatric equipment had reduced wait times and improved treatment outcomes, which in turn reduced stress on families and allowed parents to maintain stable employment. The women's shelter expansion had enabled more comprehensive services that helped women achieve long-term independence, rather than just temporary safety. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation of the evening came from an unexpected source. Thomas Rodriguez, the plant manager from Simpson Technologies' Ohio facility, had driven down from Columbus to attend the Foundation's celebration. When he approached Audrey during the reception, his presence surprised her. "Mrs. Simpson, I hope you don't mind that I came tonight," Thomas said. "I know there's been some tension with your family about business decisions, but I wanted you to know how much your leadership has meant to all of us at the Ohio plant." Thomas explained that word of Audrey's philanthropic foundation had spread throughout the Simpson Technologies workforce, where it was seen as an extension of the values that had always guided the company's operations. "Your employees understand that a leader who invests in community development is also a leader who invests in her workforce," Thomas said. He went on to describe how the foundation's work had inspired similar initiatives among Simpson Technologies employees, who had organized their own volunteer programs and fundraising efforts to support local organizations in their communities. "You've shown us that business success creates opportunities to make a positive difference, and that lesson is spreading throughout the entire company." As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Audrey found herself reflecting on the contrast between this celebration and her retirement party just months earlier. Then, she had been surrounded by people who were politely appreciative of her achievements but ultimately focused on their own networking and social climbing. Tonight, she was surrounded by people whose lives had been genuinely transformed by her decision to invest in their potential, and whose gratitude was rooted in real, measurable improvements to their circumstances. Margaret Chen, who had attended the evening as both legal counsel and friend, joined Audrey as she prepared to leave. "How are you feeling about everything?" Margaret asked. Audrey considered the question seriously. 6 months earlier, she had been grieving the loss of relationships with her children, and questioning whether she had made the right decision in redirecting her inheritance away from her family. Tonight, surrounded by evidence of the foundation's transformational impact, she felt nothing but profound satisfaction with her choices. "I feel like I've finally aligned my resources with my values," Audrey said. "For the first time in months, I'm not carrying the weight of trying to bridge the gap between what I believe is important and what my family thinks is important." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "Have you heard anything from Richard, Patricia, or Michael since the foundation launched?" The question touched on the one source of ongoing sadness in Audrey's life. Her children had not attended the foundation's launch event, had not acknowledged its success, and had maintained their position that she had made a catastrophic error in judgment that had destroyed their family's financial future. "I received a legal letter from their attorney demanding to review the foundation's governance structure for potential conflicts of interest," Audrey said. "But no personal communication. I think they're still hoping to find some way to challenge my decisions through the courts." Margaret's expression grew serious. "Are you concerned about their legal challenge?" Audrey shook her head. "The foundation was structured specifically to prevent that kind of interference. But I'm saddened that they would rather spend their energy trying to undo my philanthropic work than finding ways to contribute to it." The conversation was interrupted by Carmen Santos, who approached with a tablet displaying the foundation's latest impact metrics. "Audrey, I wanted to share some preliminary data from our 6-month evaluation. The results are exceeding every benchmark we established." The numbers were indeed remarkable. Educational achievement scores had improved across every demographic group served by the Foundation's programs. Employment rates in the target communities had increased by 37%, with participants in Foundation job training programs earning an average of 52% more than they had in their previous positions. Healthcare outcomes had improved as a result of better access to services and preventative care programs. But beyond the quantitative measures, Carmen highlighted qualitative changes that were equally significant. "We're seeing increased community engagement, with more residents volunteering for local organizations and participating in civic activities. Property values have started to increase in neighborhoods where our programs are concentrated, which creates additional stability for homeowners, while still maintaining affordability for renters through our housing assistance programs." As Audrey reviewed the data, she realized that the foundation was achieving exactly the kind of comprehensive community development that she had envisioned. Rather than simply addressing individual problems in isolation, the foundation's integrated approach was strengthening the entire social and economic ecosystem of the communities it served. The drive home from the community center gave Audrey time to process the evening's revelations and their implications for her ongoing relationship with her children. The foundation's success had validated her decision to prioritize strategic philanthropy over family wealth preservation, but it had also highlighted the fundamental values gap that separated her from Richard, Patricia, and Michael. At home, Audrey found a voice message waiting on her answering machine. The caller was her granddaughter Sophie, who was now a senior in high school and preparing for college applications. "Grandma Audrey, I hope you get this message." Sophie's voice was tentative but determined. "I know there's been a lot of family drama about the foundation, but I wanted you to know that Emma and I think what you're doing is amazing. We've been reading about the programs online, and we're really proud that our grandmother is making such a difference in people's lives." Sophie went on to explain that she and her twin sister had been having their own conversations about wealth, privilege, and responsibility as they prepared to enter adulthood. "We don't understand why Dad and Aunt Patricia are so upset about the foundation. It seems like the foundation is doing exactly what you always taught us was important, using advantages to help other people have opportunities too." The message continued with Sophie asking if she and Emma could visit during their upcoming school break to learn more about the foundation's work and potentially volunteer with some of the youth programs. "We want to understand how to use our education and opportunities responsibly, the way you've always shown us." Audrey felt a surge of hope as she listened to Sophie's message. Perhaps the values she had tried to instill in her family hadn't been completely lost. Perhaps the next generation would understand the importance of using privilege as a platform for positive change, rather than simply as a source of personal comfort and security. The following week brought an unexpected phone call from David Kim, the community college professor who had been developing the new STEM program with foundation support. "Audrey, I have some news that I think will interest you. We've been contacted by Richard Simpson about potential collaboration between Simpson Technologies and our workforce development programs." Audrey was surprised by this development, given Richard's previous dismissal of the foundation's work and his criticism of her charitable giving priorities. "What kind of collaboration is he proposing?" Professor Kim explained that Richard had approached the college about creating an internship program that would allow STEM students to gain experience at Simpson Technologies, while providing the company with access to emerging talent from diverse backgrounds. He specifically mentioned that he wanted to explore partnerships that would strengthen the local workforce while supporting the company's growth objectives. As Professor Kim described the proposal in more detail, Audrey realized that Richard might be beginning to understand the strategic value of community investment, even if he hadn't acknowledged his change in perspective directly. The internship program he was proposing would create exactly the kind of mutually beneficial relationship between business and community that Audrey had always advocated. "What's your assessment of his proposal?" Audrey asked. "Honestly, it's quite thoughtful," Professor Kim said. "He seems to understand that workforce development requires long-term investment in education and training, rather than just recruitment of already trained workers. The program he's outlined would create sustainable pipelines for advancement while addressing some of the economic challenges facing our graduates." The conversation left Audrey wondering whether Richard's apparent change in perspective represented genuine personal growth or simply practical adaptation to changing business realities. Either way, his willingness to explore community partnerships suggested that her decision to prioritize philanthropic investment over family inheritance might be influencing his thinking in positive ways. The mystery was partially resolved a few days later when Audrey received a formal letter from Richard requesting a meeting to discuss potential collaboration between Simpson Technologies and the Simpson Community Foundation. The letter was professional and respectful, acknowledging the foundation's success while proposing ways that the company and foundation might work together to achieve shared objectives. Audrey agreed to the meeting, curious about Richard's motivations and hoping that it might represent an opportunity for healing the rift that had developed between them. They met at a neutral location, a small restaurant downtown that offered privacy for what could be a difficult conversation. Richard arrived looking somewhat different than he had during their last confrontation. He seemed less combative and more thoughtful, as if the intervening months had given him time to reconsider his initial reactions to her philanthropic decisions. "Mother, thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Richard began. "I know our last conversation didn't end well, and I've been doing a lot of thinking about everything that's happened." Audrey waited for him to continue, noting that he seemed genuinely nervous about the conversation, rather than confident and demanding as he had been during their previous interactions. "I want to start by acknowledging that the foundation has achieved remarkable results," Richard said. "I've been following the impact reports, and it's clear that your investment strategy has created significant positive change in the community. The admission surprised Audrey, given Richard's previous dismissal of charitable giving as inefficient and wasteful. "What changed your perspective?" she asked. Richard paused, apparently choosing his words carefully. "Several things, actually. First, I started noticing that our most motivated and reliable employees were coming from backgrounds similar to the families your foundation serves. When I looked more closely, I realized that many of our best workers had benefited from educational opportunities, job training programs, or community support services at some point in their lives." He went on to explain that his analysis of workforce development had led him to understand the connection between community investment and business success in ways he hadn't previously considered. "I also started paying attention to our corporate reputation and customer loyalty metrics. Companies that are genuinely committed to community development have measurable advantages in employee retention, customer satisfaction, and brand value." Audrey found herself cautiously optimistic about Richard's apparent evolution in thinking, but she was also aware that his newfound appreciation for community investment might be motivated more by business considerations than by genuine commitment to the values that had always guided her philanthropy. "Richard, I'm glad you're seeing the strategic value of community investment," she said. "But I'm curious about your broader perspective on the Foundation's mission and methods." Richard's response revealed both growth and limitations in his thinking. "I think the Foundation is doing important work, and I can see how it benefits both the community and local businesses. I'm hoping we can find ways to collaborate that would amplify those benefits while creating additional opportunities for Simpson Technologies to support workforce development." The conversation that followed was more productive than Audrey had expected, with Richard outlining several potential partnership initiatives that would genuinely serve both Foundation objectives and company interests. His proposals were thoughtful and demonstrated a much deeper understanding of community needs than he had shown in previous discussions. But as the meeting progressed, Audrey also realized that Richard's evolution was incomplete. He now understood the practical value of community investment, but he still seemed to view philanthropy primarily as a business strategy rather than as a moral imperative. His appreciation for the Foundation's work was rooted in its measurable benefits, rather than in fundamental beliefs about responsibility and social justice. "Richard, I appreciate your interest in collaboration, and I think some of your proposals have real merit," Audrey said as their meeting drew to a close. "But I need to ask you directly. Do you understand why I made the decision to establish the Foundation instead of leaving the majority of my assets to you and your siblings?" The question clearly made Richard uncomfortable, forcing him to confront the underlying values conflict that had led to their estrangement. "I think I'm beginning to understand," he said slowly. "You wanted to ensure that your resources would be used according to your principles rather than risking that we might use them differently." It was a diplomatic way of acknowledging that Audrey had correctly assessed her children's priorities and values, though Richard stopped short of admitting that those assessments had been accurate. "And do you think I made the right decision?" Audrey asked. Richard's pause was long enough to be meaningful. "I think you made the decision that was consistent with your values and beliefs. I can't say I would have made the same choice, but I can see that it's producing the outcomes you wanted to achieve." As they parted ways, Audrey felt a mixture of hope and realism about her relationship with Richard. His willingness to acknowledge the Foundation's success and explore collaboration opportunities represented significant progress from his initial hostility and dismissal. But his evolution seemed to be motivated more by pragmatic recognition of the Foundation's effectiveness than by genuine conversion to her philanthropic values. The following months brought additional signs that her children were gradually adapting to the new reality of their family's financial circumstances. Patricia began attending Foundation events, initially as a skeptical observer but eventually as a more engaged participant who offered useful suggestions for program improvements. Michael, who had initially been the most bitter about the inheritance decisions, started volunteering with the Foundation's legal clinic, providing pro bono services to low-income families navigating complex legal challenges. But perhaps the most significant development came when Sophie and Emma, now college freshmen, requested to serve on the Foundation's Youth Advisory Board. Their application essays demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of the Foundation's mission, and a genuine commitment to using their education and opportunities to continue their grandmother's work. Grandma Audrey taught us that privilege creates responsibility, Sophie wrote in her application. The foundation shows us how to turn that responsibility into action that creates real change in people's lives. We want to learn how to be effective philanthropists, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the most meaningful way to use the advantages we've been given. Emma's essay focused on the intergenerational impact of strategic philanthropy. When I see the children who are succeeding in school because of foundation programs, I realize that those children will grow up to be the kind of adults who invest in the next generation. The foundation isn't just helping people today. It's creating a culture of mutual support and community investment that will continue long after we're gone. Reading her granddaughter's essays, Audrey realized that her decision to prioritize philanthropic values over family wealth preservation had indeed preserved the most important elements of her legacy. The next generation was learning to see inherited advantage as an opportunity for service rather than simply as a source of personal security. As she sat in her study on a quiet evening, surrounded by reports documenting the Foundation's expanding impact and planning documents for new initiatives, Audrey reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The confrontation with her children had been painful, but it had also been necessary to clarify her values and priorities. The woman who had been dismissed by her own children as having nothing to offer had created a foundation that was transforming her entire community. The wealth that her children had wanted to preserve and accumulate was being transformed into education, opportunity, and hope for thousands of people who were using those resources to build better lives for themselves and their families. Most importantly, Audrey had learned that the most profound inheritance she could leave wasn't financial assets, but values and principles that would continue to guide positive change long after she was gone. Her granddaughters understood that lesson in ways their parents never had, and they were committed to carrying forward the work she had begun. The Foundation's success had vindicated Audrey's belief that strategic philanthropy could create more lasting value than wealth preservation, and her family's gradual acceptance of that reality offered hope that the values she had spent her lifetime advocating might eventually be embraced by the people she loved most. In choosing to give her fortune to everyone except her children, Audrey Simpson had discovered that she had everything to offer to people who were ready to receive it and use it well. The transformation was complete, and the legacy was secure. 2 years after the Simpson Community Foundation celebrated its first anniversary, Audrey found herself standing in the conference room of Sterling and Associates for a very different kind of meeting than the one that had shocked her children with the announcement of her philanthropic decisions. This time, the room was filled with Foundation board members, community leaders, and representatives from organizations whose work had been transformed by strategic investment in human potential and community development. Margaret Chen had called the meeting to present the results of an independent evaluation of the Foundation's impact, conducted by researchers from the State University who had spent 18 months analyzing both quantitative outcomes and qualitative changes in the communities served by Foundation programs. The findings exceeded even Audrey's most optimistic projections for what strategic philanthropy could accomplish. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead researcher on the evaluation team, addressed the gathered group with the enthusiasm of someone who had witnessed remarkable social change firsthand. The Simpson Community Foundation represents a new model for philanthropic investment, one that addresses systemic challenges rather than just managing symptoms, she began. The comprehensive study had tracked over 3,000 individuals who had participated in Foundation programs, measuring not just immediate outcomes, but long-term changes in education, employment, health, and community engagement. The results painted a picture of transformation that extended far beyond the direct beneficiaries to encompass entire families and neighborhoods. Educational achievement has improved across every demographic group in Foundation target areas, Dr. Mitchell reported. High school graduation rates have increased by 43%, college enrollment among low-income students has more than doubled, and early childhood literacy scores have reached levels that were previously seen only in the most affluent districts. But the educational improvements were just one dimension of broader social and economic changes that had rippled throughout the communities where the Foundation concentrated its investments. Employment rates had stabilized at levels significantly above national averages, with foundation job training participants showing remarkable persistence in their new careers and advancement into supervisory and management positions. Carmen Santos, now serving as the Foundation's Director of Community Partnerships, provided additional context for the statistical improvements. What the numbers don't fully capture is the change in community culture, she explained. We're seeing increased civic participation, more volunteerism, stronger neighborhood networks, and a general sense that positive change is possible and sustainable. Carmen described how the Foundation's comprehensive approach had created a virtuous cycle of community development. Families with stable employment were more likely to invest in homeownership, which strengthened neighborhoods and created additional local economic activity. Children who succeeded academically became peer mentors and role models, which improved school culture and raised expectations for all students. Adults who received job training often returned as volunteer instructors, which expanded program capacity while providing meaningful ways for community members to contribute to each other's success. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Animal Rescue Organization provided an unexpected perspective on the Foundation's community impact. We've seen a dramatic reduction in pet surrenders, but more importantly, we've seen increased adoption rates and longer-term success in pet ownership, she reported. When families have economic stability and access to support services, they're able to maintain the emotional and financial commitments that successful pet ownership requires. Dr. Walsh's observation illustrated one of the Foundation's most significant achievements: the interconnected nature of its impact across seemingly unrelated areas of community life. Economic stability improved family relationships, which improved educational outcomes, which improved long-term economic prospects, which strengthened community institutions and social networks. The meeting's most powerful moment came when Maria Gonzalez, the scholarship recipient who is now completing her PhD in biomedical engineering, presented the preliminary results of her research on prosthetic technology. The Foundation didn't just fund my education, Maria explained. It taught me that receiving opportunities creates an obligation to create opportunities for others. Maria had designed her doctoral research specifically to address challenges faced by low-income amputees who couldn't afford high-quality prosthetic devices. Her work was leading toward the development of cost-effective prosthetics that could dramatically improve quality of life for thousands of people worldwide. But beyond the technical innovation, Maria had also established a mentorship program that connected college students from underrepresented backgrounds with research opportunities in biomedical engineering. Every scholarship recipient I know feels the same responsibility to pay forward the opportunities they've received, Maria continued. The Foundation has created a network of people who are committed to using their education and careers to address social challenges and expand opportunities for others. As Audrey listened to the presentation of the Foundation's achievements, she reflected on the contrast between this gathering and the family confrontation that had occurred in this same building 2 years earlier. Then, she had been surrounded by people who questioned her judgment and dismissed her values. Today, she was surrounded by evidence that those values, when properly supported and implemented, could create transformational change that benefited entire communities. Thomas Rodriguez, the plant manager from Simpson Technologies' Ohio facility, had traveled to attend the meeting as a representative of the company's Employee Engagement Committee. Mrs. Simpson, I wanted to share some developments at the company that I think you'll find encouraging, he said during the open discussion period. Thomas explained that Simpson Technologies had become a model employer in the region, with employee satisfaction scores and retention rates that significantly exceeded industry averages. The company's commitment to community investment and employee welfare, which Richard had once criticized as inefficient sentiment, had become a powerful competitive advantage in recruiting and maintaining talented workers. We have engineers and managers who turn down higher-paying offers from other companies because they want to work for an organization that aligns with their values, Thomas reported. Our community partnerships have also strengthened our customer relationships and opened new market opportunities that have increased revenues by 27% over the past 2 years. Richard had apparently learned to present these business benefits without acknowledging their connection to the philanthropic principles he had once dismissed. But Thomas's report confirmed that Audrey's approach to balancing profit with purpose had been validated even within the family business. The meeting concluded with Margaret Chen presenting the Foundation's strategic plan for the next 5 years, which included expansion into neighboring communities and the development of additional programs designed to address emerging challenges such as digital literacy, renewable energy workforce development, and support for elderly residents aging in place. The Foundation's initial success has attracted attention from other philanthropists and organizations who want to replicate our model, Margaret explained. We're developing a consulting program that will help other communities implement similar comprehensive approaches to social and economic development. As the meeting participants began to depart, Audrey found herself in conversation with Dr. Helen Foster from Roosevelt Elementary, who had become one of the Foundation's most effective advocates and a model for how educational institutions could partner with philanthropic organizations to achieve systematic change. Audrey, I've been thinking about the legacy question that seems to come up in every interview about the Foundation, Dr. Foster said. Reporters always want to know whether you're disappointed about not leaving your wealth to your children. But watching what's happened over the past 2 years, I think you've created a much more powerful legacy than inherited wealth could ever provide. Dr. Foster gestured toward the young adults who were serving as Foundation interns and volunteers, many of whom were former scholarship recipients who had returned to contribute to the programs that had supported their own development. These young people understand that privilege creates responsibility, and that success is measured by the positive impact you create rather than the wealth you accumulate. They're going to carry those values into their careers and families, which means your influence will continue expanding for generations. The observation resonated deeply with Audrey, who had always believed that the most important inheritance she could leave was a commitment to using advantages responsibly, rather than simply preserving them selfishly. The Foundation had created exactly the kind of values-based legacy she had hoped to establish, while also producing measurable improvements in the lives of thousands of people who had been given opportunities to realize their potential. Walking to her car after the meeting, Audrey encountered an unexpected visitor in the parking lot. Patricia was waiting beside Audrey's vehicle, looking somewhat nervous, but determined to have a conversation that had apparently been weighing on her mind. "Mother, I hope you have a few minutes to talk," Patricia said. "I know I haven't been very supportive of the Foundation, and I wanted to explain why I'm here today." Audrey had noticed Patricia attending Foundation events with increasing frequency over the past year, but they hadn't had any substantial conversations about her changing perspective on the philanthropic work that had initially sparked such bitter family conflict. "I'm listening," Audrey said, genuinely curious about what had motivated Patricia to seek out this conversation. Patricia took a deep breath before beginning. "I've been volunteering with the Women's Shelter Expansion Project, helping women develop business plans for small enterprises that will give them economic independence after they leave abusive situations." Audrey was surprised by this revelation, as Patricia had never mentioned her volunteer work and had previously shown little interest in the social service aspects of the Foundation's mission. "The women I'm working with are incredibly resilient and resourceful," Patricia continued. "They just need access to capital, mentorship, and support systems to build successful businesses that can support their families. Helping them develop those businesses has been the most meaningful work I've ever done." As Patricia described her volunteer experiences, Audrey realized that her daughter was discovering the same satisfaction that had always motivated Audrey's philanthropic work. The deep fulfillment that comes from using privilege and expertise to create opportunities for others to succeed. "I owe you an apology," Patricia said quietly. "When you established the Foundation, I thought you were being sentimental and impractical. I thought charitable giving was something wealthy people did to feel good about themselves, rather than something that could create real, sustainable change. I was wrong about that, and I was wrong about a lot of other things too." The admission represented a significant evolution from Patricia's previous dismissal of philanthropic work as inefficient emotion rather than strategic investment. But Audrey sensed that her daughter's growth went beyond simply recognizing the practical effectiveness of charitable giving. "What changed your perspective?" Audrey asked. "Working directly with the shelter clients made me realize that most people who struggle economically aren't struggling because they lack intelligence or motivation," Patricia explained. "They're struggling because they haven't had access to the same opportunities and support systems that allowed me to succeed. Once I understood that, I started seeing charitable giving not as helping the deserving poor, but as addressing systemic inequities that prevent talented people from reaching their potential." Patricia's analysis reflected exactly the kind of sophisticated thinking about social and economic justice that Audrey had always hoped her children would develop. The foundation's work had apparently provided Patricia with opportunities to engage directly with social challenges in ways that had expanded her understanding of how communities functioned and how privilege could be used responsibly. I also want you to know that David and I have decided to establish our own family foundation focused on supporting women entrepreneurs, Patricia continued. We want Sophie and Emma to grow up understanding that inherited advantage creates opportunities to serve others, rather than just to accumulate more wealth for ourselves. The announcement surprised and pleased Audrey, who realized that Patricia was not just acknowledging the value of philanthropic work, but committing to making it central to her own family's values and priorities. The next generation would indeed learn to see inherited privilege as a platform for positive change, rather than simply as a source of personal security. As they concluded their conversation, Patricia made one final observation that encapsulated the transformation that had occurred within the family over the past 2 years. Mother, when you told us that we didn't value what you had to offer, I thought you were being dramatic and unfair. Now I understand that you were being accurate and generous. You offered us the opportunity to be part of something meaningful and transformational, and we rejected it because we were focused on narrow financial calculations, rather than broader questions about purpose and legacy. Driving home from what had been one of the most satisfying days of her philanthropic career, Audrey reflected on the journey that had brought her from being an undervalued matriarch whose children questioned her judgment to being a respected community leader whose vision had created lasting positive change. The transformation had required courage to prioritize her values over family harmony, but the results had validated every difficult decision she had made. The foundation's success had demonstrated that strategic philanthropy could create more profound and lasting impact than inherited wealth, while also proving that her business expertise and community knowledge had significant value when applied to social challenges. Most importantly, the foundation had created a model for how privilege could be used responsibly to expand opportunities for others, rather than simply to preserve advantages for those who already possessed them. As she pulled into her driveway, Audrey noticed that her garden was in full bloom, the roses and perennials creating a tapestry of color that reflected the careful tending and patient cultivation required for lasting beauty. The metaphor seemed appropriate for the foundation's work, which had required similar patience and attention to create sustainable change that would continue growing and flourishing long after she was gone. The evening brought a phone call from her granddaughter Sophie, who was now in her sophomore year of college and serving as student coordinator for the Foundation's Youth Advisory Board. Grandma Audrey, I wanted to share some exciting news about our campus chapter of Students for Strategic Philanthropy, Sophie said, with the enthusiasm that had always characterized her approach to meaningful work. Sophie explained that the student organization she had founded was expanding to additional universities, with each chapter developing community partnerships and philanthropic projects that addressed local challenges while providing students with experience in effective social change work. We're not just raising money for charities, Sophie explained. We're learning how to identify systemic problems, develop comprehensive solutions, and measure long-term impact. The Foundation's model has inspired students across the country to think strategically about how to use their education and future careers to create positive change. As Audrey listened to Sophie describe the expanding network of young philanthropists who were committed to using their advantages responsibly, she realized that the Foundation's influence was extending far beyond the immediate community it served. The values and methods that had guided the Foundation's work were being adopted and adapted by young people who would carry those principles into their own careers and communities. The conversation concluded with Sophie asking for advice about her post-graduation plans, which included law school, followed by a career in nonprofit management and social policy development. I want to spend my life working on the kind of systematic change that the Foundation has demonstrated is possible, Sophie said. You've shown me that the most meaningful way to use privilege is to expand opportunities for others to succeed. After ending the call, Audrey sat in her study surrounded by the photographs, awards, and documents that chronicled her journey from successful business owner to transformational philanthropist. The woman whose own children had once questioned what she had to offer had created a foundation that was changing thousands of lives while inspiring a new generation of leaders committed to using privilege responsibly. The Foundation's success had vindicated Audrey's belief that her wealth could create more value when invested in human potential and community development than when simply preserved and accumulated for family inheritance. But more than the quantitative measures of impact, the foundation had demonstrated that values-based decision-making could produce results that exceeded the most optimistic projections for what strategic philanthropy could accomplish. Most importantly, Audrey had learned that choosing to align her resources with her principles had created a legacy that would continue expanding long after she was gone, as the people whose lives had been transformed by foundation programs carried forward the commitment to using their own success to create opportunities for others. In offering her fortune to everyone except her ungrateful children, Audrey Simpson had discovered that she had everything to offer to people who were ready to receive it and use it well. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.